What happens 1 minute after you die? From time to time, I have made a comment that there is such a thing called funeral home talk. And that's not a bad thing. In fact, generally speaking, it's a good thing. Funeral home talk. People standing by the casket, and they say things like, well, Dad is now back with Mom. Or, you know, Mom was in a wheelchair for 2 years before she died, and now she and Dad are dancing in heaven. Or, you know, Dad couldn't really eat. He was in that home. They had to grind up all of his food. By the way, if you want an experience, go to old people's home and look at the food that some of them have to eat. They puree it. Blah. And now he's feasting in heaven. He's just having a banquet. That kind of talk is good talk. It's funeral home talk, but it's good talk. And you might think, well, yeah, but that's not really the way it happens, because isn't it true that when you die, your soul goes to heaven? Some kind of a little thing within you, some piece or part of you that leaves the body and goes up into the air, goes up, 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 up into heaven, and just kind of bounces around for a while until the resurrection? And the answer is no, that isn't what happens. Down through history, the view of the human being has oftentimes been characterized by what is called dichotomy, or a dichotomistic view of the human being. And dichotomy means to divide into two parts. And those two parts were called body and soul. Some of you may have run across what are called trichotomists, tri meaning three, body, soul, and spirit. And you may have even gotten into discussions or heard discussions where people are debating, well, what is the soul and what is the spirit, and how is the soul different from the spirit, and how do they interact, and what really goes to heaven when you die? Is it the spirit or is it the soul? That is not biblical talk. I do not believe that that is good teaching when it comes to the human being. Even though it's been part of our heritage, it has been part of history. You go to people like John Calvin and St. Augustine and others, and they will talk about the body and the soul, or the body, soul, and spirit. But that just isn't the way that the Bible talks. It does use words like body, soul, and spirit, but the idea that we are somehow divided into 2 or 3 parts, and that one of those parts floats up into the air when we die, just is not taught in the Bible. I believe the funeral home talk, that Dad is now having a feast after eating all that pureed food, and he and Mom are dancing together, that's actually, as you're going to hear this morning, much more accurate and biblical than the idea that when you die, your soul goes to heaven. I've been doing reading out of different books, and as I said a few weeks ago, one of the books that I read while I was on vacation is this book called Heaven by Randy Alcorn. I would highly recommend it. It is not one of those popular books where somebody dies and then they go to heaven and they walk around and they see Aunt Phyllis and Uncle Herbert and then they come back to life again. It's not one of those. He researches the Bible, very careful researching of the Bible, and comes to some very interesting conclusions about what happens 1 minute after you die. And not only that, but the idea that life is really what we are living now, then 1 minute after we die, called the intermediate state, and then the resurrected body and life experience. So what is now, what will be a minute after we die, and then when the trumpet sounds and Jesus comes again and we have the resurrection, that is the next part. We have the present existence, the intermediate state, and then the resurrected body, the resurrected life. And what we're talking about this morning, next week will be the resurrected life. What we're talking about this morning is that intermediate state. What happens 1 minute after you die? And it is not that the soul goes to heaven. Randy Alcorn has a great explanation of this, one that I have used before. Maybe you have heard me talk about this. He gives it a name. He calls it Christoplatonism. And it's called Christo because Christians have taught it, and it's called Platonism because it is rooted in the ideas of the philosopher Plato. Plato taught that we are body and soul, and that when we die, this piece of us called the soul goes floating off into the universe. And what Christian thinkers did is they picked up on Plato's idea, the Greek philosopher's idea, and they incorporated that into Christianity. In fact, they actually did that with quite a few things. See, many of the original Christian thinkers had been converted out of Greek background. They had been Greek philosophers, Greek thinkers. And so they took a lot of that Greek thinking that they had and they adapted it to Christianity, or maybe we should say they adapted Christianity to their Greek thinking. Now that's not all bad, because it was simply a way to help people understand more about the Bible and more about Christianity and more about life. But the problem in this area is it just ain't true. And one of the parts of Randy Alcorn's book gets at some ideas that I have toyed with in the past, but have really come now to say, this is the way it is. And here's what he teaches from the Bible. That when we die, 1 minute after we die, we go to a unique place that God has created and prepared, in which we will have real bodies, we will have real relationships, we will eat, we will wear clothes. And you say, well, how could God do that? Well, how could he create the world in the first place, if you figure that one out? And how can he have resurrected bodies, take our bodies after they decay and recreate them and make them into new bodies, what Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians 15? So God can do it. That's not the problem. The question is, does the Bible really teach that? So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the Bible. Now, the idea is that when we die, we do go to be with the Lord, but not as a puffy little cloud floating around, bouncing around, but as real people. The Apostle Paul talks that way in Philippians chapter 1. In Philippians chapter 1, the Apostle Paul is trying to decide whether he wants to live or die. He's been beaten up, he's been brutally abused, and he says, you know, I get kind of sick of this. I think it might be better if I die. He says, what would be better? If I serve my churches or if I just die and go to be with the Lord? Look at what he says. Philippians chapter 1, verse 23. He says, I'm torn between the two, that is living and dying. He says, I desire to depart, that is to die, and be with Christ. Now notice, he says, I will be with Christ. I. Not a puffy cloud, not a piece of me, but I will be. I, the real person. And I want to show you now what I mean when I say that in this book by Randy Elkhorn, and what I have come to believe, means that when we die, we go to a place that God has prepared for us with real bodies, with real life, with real relationships, just like, maybe building sheds together and being unified. But let's take a look at what the Bible teaches. Are you ready? Here we go. We're going to take a journey, and we're going to begin with the book of Revelation. In Revelation chapter 2, we have the letter to the church in Ephesus. The opening chapters of Revelation are those letters to the 7 churches. And the letter to the church of Ephesus, the angel to the church of Ephesus writes these words and says, "Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who is victorious," that is, to the one who has lived their life as a believer, as a Christian, and then dies, "to the one who is victorious, I will give the right to eat." From the tree of life. Now, if you're going to eat, you got to have a body. You got to have a mouth. You got to have, usually have teeth. "I will give the right to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God." You know what the word paradise means? In the original language, it means a beautiful garden. A beautiful garden. Kind of like the Garden of Eden. And so what it says is, whoever has ears, okay, are you listening? Are you listening? He says, if you are faithful to Jesus and you die a believer, then you will eat in that beautiful garden. Revelation 2. Now somebody might say, but wait a minute, isn't the book of Revelation symbolic? This is symbolic. Yes, it is. The book of Revelation is symbolic. But there are also parts of it that are very literal. There's a blending in the book of Revelation between the literal and the symbolic. And for the letter to the church to say, when you as a believer die, you will go to a beautiful garden and eat. That's not symbolic. That's pretty real. Or here, let's go on to the next one, which is also in the book of Revelation, and this is Revelation chapter 6, starting at verse 9. "When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls." Now wait a minute. He is looking into heaven. And as he looks into heaven, he says, "I saw the souls of those who had been killed for their faith." Now someone might say, but wait a minute, doesn't that prove that it is your soul that floats off to heaven? Aha. Something to learn about Bible translations is that translators have to find an English word that fits the Greek or the Hebrew. And oftentimes, and this is not necessarily bad, in this case it is, but they will use an English word that promotes their interpretation and their understanding of that particular passage. See that word souls there? You know what original Greek word that is? When God made Adam, remember in the book of Genesis, it says that God made Adam out of the dust of the earth. Kind of like God went down to the beach and made a beach sand Adam. And then it says breathed into him the breath of life. Well, when you have the full Adam, the body, the spirit, the breath, the mind, the will, the emotions, when you have the full Adam, then it says that full Adam is, and that's the word that was used. That's the word. The word soul here probably is not a good translation. Often, in fact, tonight we're going to analyze that word some more in a different passage. But often that word means self or person or individual or the mind. And in this case, I believe that what he is seeing is people. And that word is often used in the Bible simply to mean selves, individuals, people. I am seeing people. And so he says, not souls like puffy little clouds, but he says, I opened the fifth seal and I saw under the altar people who had been killed because of their faith and the testimony they maintained. And what are these people doing? They called out in a loud voice. Now, if you're going to call out, you need to have a larynx, you need to have a throat, you need to have a tongue, you need to have breath. They called out. You need to have a mouth. How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood? Then each of them was given a white robe to wear. Now, if you're going to wear a robe, you got to have a body to put it on. Aha. And they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants, brothers and sisters, were killed. So what we have is John looks into heaven, and what does he see? He sees people who are shouting, and they're eating, and they're wearing clothes. They got to have bodies. Let's have one more out of the book of Revelation. This is Revelation chapter 7. After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count. John is looking into heaven, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing. If you stand, you have to have legs, usually, feet. Standing before the throne, and they were wearing white robes and holding palm branches in their hands. So they got feet, they've got legs, they've got hands, they got bodies with robes on, and they're eating and they're shouting in that beautiful garden. You say, why? But that's the book of Revelation. Well, let's go to Hebrews. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, we read, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. Now, the witnesses here are the Old Testament saints. And the idea in Hebrews is that the Old Testament saints are watching the people who are alive on earth. They're watching them. So while you guys were on your mission trip, Old Testament saints were probably watching you. Great cloud of witnesses. Let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily, and let us run with perseverance. That's what they want to see in the people that are alive here and now. But the great cloud of witnesses are Old Testament saints. Now, if they are watching, they got to have eyes. And there's a little bit more about them in the chapter that comes before this one, in Hebrews chapter 11. In Hebrews 11, verse 16, it said, they, that is these Old Testament saints, were longing for a better country, a heavenly one, and therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. A city. People live in cities. So he's prepared a city. And a beautiful garden, with bodies wearing robes, hands holding palm branches, legs and feet standing, voices calling out. Let's do one more in Hebrews. In Hebrews chapter 8, verse 5, we read they. Now the they here, the they is the Old Testament priests who were in the tabernacle and then later on in the temple. It says, they serve as priests in a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. Well, what's in heaven? Well, if the tabernacle and the temple is a copy of what is in heaven, that means that heaven, which is a city, And a beautiful garden has in it a temple, a tabernacle, a building. And this is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle, see to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown to you on the mountain. So now we have a place of worship, a place where people come together to worship. They've got voices, they got arms, they got legs, they've got hands. They're eating in a beautiful garden, in a city, with bodies, with clothes on. You say, well, okay, Hebrews and, well, let's go to the Apostle Paul, 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. In 2 Corinthians 5, it says, we know that if the earthly tent, that's our existing bodies, we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven. We got a house. Remember what Jesus said in John 14? In my Father's house are many rooms, and I get one ready for you. What kind of a room do you want? I used to think that that was simply symbolic language, but now I don't believe it's symbolic. I believe it's real. There's a house, there's rooms, there's a city, there's a garden, there's a temple or tabernacle in which to worship so that we can go there with our bodies, with our voices, a building, an eternal house not built by human hands. And meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed, there it is again, with our heavenly dwelling. Instead, with our heavenly dwelling. Because when we are clothed, we will not be found naked. Now, you can't be naked if you don't have a body. Okay? If you're going to be naked, you have to have a body. That's a qualification. Except we're going to put clothes on in a city, in a garden, and eat, and hold palm branches in hands, and stand, and shout, and sing. And so when Jesus in Luke chapter 23 says to the thief on the cross, remember, he says, today you will be with me in that garden. And therefore, I believe that we have to shift our thinking from soul goes to heaven, or we float around, or those stupid ideas about angels' wings and bouncing around on clouds and all of that, that God has actually created a unique place. I don't know where it is. I don't know how he did it. It's up to God. I kind of like to think it may be on a different dimension, like the fourth or fifth or sixth dimension, especially if the cloud of witnesses is watching us. They can perhaps see through the walls of the other dimensions, and they can watch what we're doing. And by the way, could mean that people are watching us, what we're doing. Well, but that's another matter. But the idea that it's a place, it's a city, it's a garden, and there's a house there, and there's rooms, and we got clothes, and we're eating. And the more I studied this and the more I became aware of it, the more some of that anxiety about death was fading away. I think we all have some anxiety about death and dying. Is it real? What about the soul going to heaven and all that, bouncing around? And I didn't really particularly like that idea. But now, the idea that I'm going to be a real person with a real body, in real relationships and doing stuff, with real hands and feet, and eat and celebrate and shout and worship, and probably work in that intermediate state. Now, the resurrected state, we're going to do that. We're going to get to that next week. But in this intermediate state, 1 minute after I die, a real human existence. And I found that doubt or that fear that sometimes enters my mind, enters my being, began to fade. Hey, if I die and I continue to be a real person, that's a beautiful idea. I believe it's that kind of courage that Abby Baker had. We've been praying for her. Randy and Janet Baker's daughter-in-law, Abby Baker, lives in Florida. She went into surgery to have part of her brain cut out because of a malignant tumor. And she sent a video around to people that she knows. And I'd like to have you watch a couple minutes of that video. Abby Baker. This is just before surgery. And by the way, she survived the surgery.
And it's not always going to be easy. I take every day, hour by hour, minute by minute, and it does not make my days easy. But I stop myself, and that's where I found the meditation and the breathing and the prayers. For me, this second surgery, that is a possibility, that God is challenging me, and God has something else that I may not have heard. So I've struggled with the fear of not seeing Brielle and Callista again. And what I'm realizing is that it's all out of my control, and that it all is in God's hands, and that no matter what I do, I can work on what I'm hearing from God, what He wants me to do, but at the end of the day, His plan is already set into motion. I'm grateful for this cancer. I've told hundreds of people that. People felt sorry for me, and there's no need to feel sorry for me, because I am very grateful for having gone through this cancer. It changed me in more ways than possible. I'm going to be going to heaven. My daughters are going to be able to look down at me if I am gone, and they're going to be able to be proud of me and hopefully learn to be strong. Cancer doesn't have to be a terrible thing. I certainly don't want it, but I would not take this away. If you were to then take me back 2 years and say, listen, do you want cancer or don't you? I would say, let's do it, because it changed me for the better. It's taught me to be grateful, thankful for each day, for each moment, for each breath. It's taught me to be understanding how blessed I am and how strong God is.
Whoa. Great faith, great confidence. And that faith and confidence can be bolstered when we understand that 1 minute after we die, we are not just floating around, bouncing off clouds, but we are real people with recreated bodies in that intermediate state before the resurrection, having real experiences, living a real life. That's exciting. That's comforting. That's God. And now as we move into the rest of our day, may we do so with joy on this day that you have made, rejoicing and glad in it. For you give us your grace and mercy and peace, and your face shining beautifully and bountifully upon us now and on into eternity. And all of God's people all together said, amen. God bless. Have a wonderful day.